What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 85, and I'm the co-host, Kyle Anslone. I'm joined by the other co-host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
Kyle, great. How you doing?
Doing great. And Will, I'm excited about the show today. Me and you did a fantastic interview with Danny Sjursen. He is a retired U.S. Army officer, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, contributing editor at antiwar.com, and director of the new Eisenhower Media Network. His work has appeared in the New York Times, LA Times, The Nation, Huff Post, The Hill, Salon, The American Conservative, Mother Jones, Scheer Post, and Tom Dispatch. He is the author of Ghostriders of Baghdad and Patriotic Descent, America in the Age of Endless War. He is also the co-host of the Fortress on the Hill podcast. So that's a whole mouthful of just a very short part of Danny's bio. He was also a professor at West Point. He served in both the Iraq and Afghan surges, and he is just a relentless reader and writer of the American empire, concerned about everything going on and all the people in the world that our policies are affecting. And one of the things that Danny does better than just about anybody else is write on Africa and try to keep up with what the U.S. military and the legacy colonial interventions that we have, like with France, going on in Africa. And so that's a lot of what we talk about on today's show. In some respects, this is a follow-up to the episode 58 when I interviewed Danny on Ethiopia. So I will drop that link in the show notes page if anybody wants to check out that episode. And just follow and support all the work that we're doing here on Conflicts of Interest. People are really psyched about the last episode. Myself, Joanne Leone, Kelly Lane, and Angela McArdell had a great talk about liberty, freedom, wars, and it was a conversation between people who are more left or come from the progressive side, and then me and Angela, who are libertarians. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Library, Odyssey as YouTube alternatives, Patreon. We have Subscribestar as a Patreon alternative if you want to donate to the show there. Will, you're on Twitter at the Will Porter. I'm at Kyle Anslone _. And the last thing we'll mention is to support the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. Talking to Carlos recently, he said that listeners to the show, people using our promo code, are starting to receive discounts and I guess enjoy their CBD products. So that was great to hear that some of you guys are trying that out. Paloma Verde store.com is where you could go to get your CBD products. I personally like their topicals, their Slav stick that CBD infused is great for relieving some minor pain. Will, we've talked about you enjoying the Edstretch with melatonin to help get to sleep, battle with insomnia.
That's right. Yeah.
It's been a long year. We haven't exercised enough, which is a blow to the physical and the mental health. So as people are getting ready, spring's coming around, you're gonna be doing a lot more physical stuff, I hope. And you're sore or you're dealing with some of the mental health stuff from the lockdowns. Check out palomaverdestore.com. Really help your life. Just be sure to use the promo code PEACE when you check out. When you spend $75 or more, that gets you a discount, 25%, and lets them know you came from this show. So, Will, let's get into the interview with Danny.
All right, let's do it.
All right, Danny, welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. It's great to have you on again. How have you been doing?
Oh, pretty good. Staying busy, trying to stay abreast of, well, gee, what is it now? 3 months of Biden foreign policy and all the things he can't control, right? All the stuff that's going on in the world and, just trying to follow the indecency and say something about it.
Right. Well, I know you've been staying busy the past few months because I've been trying to keep up reading all of your articles, and there's so much information in them, and information that you would really struggle to find somewhere else, especially all of your writing you've been doing on Africa. The last time I had you on the show, we mostly spent our time talking about Ethiopia, and there was that ethnic cleansing or rebellion in Tigray, and there's been some more information on that since I've talked about on the show. But on today's show, I think we're going to talk more about Africa in general, and then countries like Chad and Mali that you've been writing out. So one of your most recent articles at antiwar.com is titled "The Military's Africa Gambit: Thoughts, Intellectuals, and Their False Assumptions Strike Again." And here you go through this article titled by three generals or high officers in the military from foreign affairs, saying that, China and Russia are getting involved in Africa, and so now we have to get more involved in Africa. And I think this is something you actually mentioned the last time that you were on the show. And so you're saying that they're making a bunch of false assumptions here, and so shouldn't we be scared about one belt, one road, and Russia, getting involved? And I heard there was Wagner Group mercenaries in Libya and all this other terrible stuff. So what do you think about that, Danny?
I think the first thing to look at is at one point in the piece, I basically say, shame on the foreign affairs editors for publishing this. On the surface, what you've got is a retired major general who used to be in charge of special forces, all special operations jointly in Africa for AFRICOM. And then you got like two of these, guys like me kind of, right? And when I was in the military, like majors, they're SF guys, but, they've got some advanced degrees. They write a little bit. They're articulate, and they're smart guys. And so they're like this like warrior scholar thing, right? Is the play. Except that if you actually know anything about Africa, right? And I know what they would say. They'd be like, well, you spend more time in Africa than you have. It's like, well, then shame on you further, because if you actually know something about Africa, if you sit around and study this, right? If you like give up your social life to read about Africa, I know guys like that. I don't know. Maybe you've met some, had them on your pod. Then what they wrote is shameful. I mean, it's alarmism. It lacks context. It lacks backstory. It lacks any sort of contrast, scale, or any of that. And what you're really looking at here is old school imperialism, like the same rhetoric from the late 19th century has been jam-packed into this article that is, it's alarmism and imperialism masquerading as like an intellectualism and a realism. I mean, just think about a phrase that they actually wrote, and I'll leave it there. We could dig into whichever areas you're interested in. They offhandedly assert the following at like the top of their fourth paragraph in Foreign Affairs. Like, this is a serious journal, right? Presumably. Like it or not, a 21st century scramble for Africa is underway. I mean, they wrote that, and that would be so funny if they were trying for like a Jonathan Swift modest proposal, like tongue in cheek. But they're serious. And you know what that does? That scares me.
Yeah, just in terms of like the sense of proportion that it seems, they seem to miss in this foreign affairs piece. Could you just talk a little bit about like, how many Russian bases and Chinese bases are on the African continent compared to sort of the U.S. military footprint with our bases and installations?
Right. I mean, the United States has more bases in individual countries in Africa than Russia and China have in Africa, military bases. This is not to say that there aren't Russian mercenaries running around in parts of Africa, but, calling that the most evil thing ever and a reason that we have to send our military in. I mean, mercenaries in Africa? How dare they? Oh, wait, pot, meat, kettle, right? The United States, AFRICOM is a mercenary command. I mean, more than any other one. In a lot of sense, because it's always been kind of like a light footprint military thing, or at least it says it is. But compared to CENTCOM or EUCOM, the actual number of like brigades and divisions that are dedicated to it, talking ground combat forces, it's minimal. AFRICOM has to actually contract out medevac sometimes. I mean, they can't even evacuate wounded guys. So this is a mercenary command saying that the problem with the Russians is that they're being mercenaries, or they're sending Russian mercenaries. So you got that. In terms of actual military bases, I mean, first of all, China and Russia, China has very few globally. I mean, they basically have a base in Djibouti. And if you really look at it, though, if you really look at the scope of Russian and Chinese military basing in Africa, it's at like an all-time low. I mean, compared to the Cold War even. I mean, in terms of the actual influence, like, it's Djibouti. It's that little sort of like synthetic country that's like wedged between, like Somalia, Ethiopia, and, Eritrea. Like, the idea, and oh, by the way, Djibouti is loaded with like American, German, Spanish, and of course French, because it was their old colony, bases. I mean, the largest American base in Africa is Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, which, I mean, you want to talk about, like, sometimes these little anecdotes can be instructive. It's actually on the grounds of an old French Foreign Legion base. I mean, it's basically America was like, hey, where can we film a remake of Beau Geste? Except, you know, we're going to actually fight there. It's ridiculous. And so this idea that China and Russia is coming to Africa serves, I think, two purposes. One, politically at the top, it allows the Democratic Party establishment, which has just been screaming Russia and starting to scream China, to say, look, we are tough. Republicans aren't the only tough ones. Look at us. You know, check out our gym selfie in Africa, right? We're tough guys too. We're not the weak sister foreign policy party, so we're tougher on Russia than Trump was, right? And so it serves that purpose. Like, we'll use Africa to, like, be tough. The second one, though, is the bureaucratic knife fighting that happens in the Pentagon. Every one of those, you know, imperial proconsul commands that we call, you know, major combatant commands. So we're talking CENTCOM, EUCOM, SouthCom, right? PACCOM.
Right.
You know, we slice the world into these. They're all fighting for resources constantly, just like the services are, like Air Force versus Navy. Who's going to get more funding? And so everyone's always fighting for relevance. Relevance is a word that gets thrown around within the military from the rank of captain all the way up to the rank of 4-star general. You always have to stay relevant, because relevance means money. And so that means my command is important because it's under threat. So you better give us money and you better give us troops, because we need a justification to exist. And so in 2018, I watched this happen through the IG reports that I read from my sins. Throughout the military, I read them, right? I don't just read the Afghanistan one, I read the one about Africa. Very interesting quarterly report. In 2018, when the National Defense Strategy switched to say that terrorism is no longer our number one threat and focus as a nation, as a military, but great power competitions, GPC, you'll see this word just thrown around everywhere.
Right.
Wouldn't you know, there was immediately a review, like a year-long review put in place in AFRICOM to what they call align or nest. That's another fun buzzword in the military. Nest their mission with the new National Defense Strategy. So that meant they had to find Russia and China in Africa, right? In other words, they had to take the existing Russian and Chinese influence, which is mostly economic in the Chinese case, and then turn it into something bigger. So they lie, they exaggerate, they get alarmist, and then they say, see, Africa is still relevant, even though terrorism is no longer the focus, which, of course, is the big lie and the long con. And it could lead to a lot more killing and indecency in Africa.
Yeah, it's funny. I recall a U.S. military officer a few years ago saying something about how, you know, we're looking for ways to stay globally engaged in Africa. You know, we're searching for a justification to exist, basically.
And that is the casualness with which, you know, you heard that said is the story in a way. I mean, the fact that that doesn't even strike the person saying it as absurd. Like that, you know, if it's the Defense Department, right, and not the War Department and not the Empire Department, then why would we say as a military, man, we're so glad we don't have to be militarily engaged. Like, it's great that we don't have to fight. You know, Eisenhower said, like, I hate war as only the guy who saw it firsthand and all of its brutality can hate a war. Like, we're past that. We're at the point where casually mid and upper range officers, otherwise intelligent and decent people maybe, right, are like, well, we're looking for ways to be engaged because that's normal. And if you join the military anytime since like the late 90s, definitely after 9/11, this is the only army you've known. You've only known a military that is completely globally engaged and expects to be at war all the time. The fact that we don't question that assumption is how you maintain a forever war. It's part of the formula. Becomes a reflex, and it's how you get articles like this in Foreign Affairs. And I did not see any other takedowns of this thing except at antiwar.com and all the places that syndicate my stuff at the mid-range. And that's part of the story too, because this should have been devastated by anybody who knows Africa. And I'm sure academics talked about it in the break rooms, you know, who knew better, but you know, they didn't publish it anywhere, and no one wanted to publish any reactions to this.
Right. Well, that's huge, especially because, when there's no reaction to it that seeps into the mainstream at all, then, Danny, every respectable person knows that we have to do this. And they completely leave out all the great reporting that Nick Turse has done over the past few years on the expanding drone base the U.S. has in Niger. And I think they're continuing to expand that. I think there's reports of the, U.S. being involved in prison camps in Cameroon where there's some pretty nasty stuff going on in those jails. We have troops all over the place. 29 bases, but who knows how many just little camps. Like we now have 12 Green Berets in Mozambique. Where are they based? Like, what does that count as anything? And yet, they just constantly Russia, China. We have to combat Russia, China. It fits so nicely into the Belt and Road, rhetoric they already have against China, and they'll point and say, "Oh man, all these African countries are changing at their international airport the flag on Taiwan from the Taiwanese flag to the Chinese flag," as proof of why, Danny, that we need to be militarily involved in essentially colonize and dictate the what happens to the resources and to the politics and the policies of an entire continent. And I mean, there are massive countries in Africa. That's, something me and Will were talking about before this is apparently the way the maps of Africa end up usually being portrayed like this one. It doesn't actually give the correct shape of the continent. But, that Nigeria has, a couple 100 million people living there. You said on the last show, Ethiopia, like 100 million people. Like, these are massive countries with huge numbers of people in very complex and at times very old societies that the U.S. just says that because, we see some Russians and Chinese people there, we have to dictate what happens. That's really scary to me. And then, Will, we could get into like more specifics on Chad and Mali, unless you have anything else on this article.
Yeah, there's just one more thing I wanted to mention. These three military officers write about how we have to support good governance and all this stuff across the continent. But Danny, you and people, Kyle mentioned Nick Turse, Lauren Chadwick, various people have written about this. But a pretty large number of African military officers that have gone through various Pentagon training programs. I think there's one called IMET that's particularly bad. These officers that have later led coup attempts or actual coups across Africa. I think there've been like 7 over the last decade or so. It just seems interesting that the more we get involved, it seems the more instability and conflict that arises out of all this, what they call effective counterterrorism assistance and all this stuff.
Well, part of the way that I, wrote the piece was almost like a mystery science theater or whatever. I just took excerpts and then just was snarky and then explained my snark, which is right in my wheelhouse and how I like to write. But let's just take this one on what you said. One quote that they wrote. They said this, and always remember, when you get guys like this writing in foreign affairs, the way that they write, it's basically like a buzzword bingo of nonsense. The language is dead shark eyes language. You know what I mean? That's what there's nothing to it. I mean, it's terrible writing. I mean, it's just like blah, like it's just the worst, right? But they say nothing while saying all kinds of things. So it's by offering sustained and effective counterterrorism assistance. Okay, I pause them there and I say, well, actually, by every metric, every time America gets involved, every place we've gotten involved in Africa, the attacks, the violence, the terror groups exploded, right? So we're actually we've never done anything just effective. Okay, but what they say is, by doing that effective counterterrorism assistance, the United States can become the partner of choice for African countries, encouraging them to develop their economies and political systems in accordance with Western norms. Well, as you mentioned, that's a fascinating thing to say when serious academic studies, none of which were cited in this piece, of course, existing important ones, peer-reviewed, have showed that actually, if a partnered military officer has gone to an IMET, right, International Military and Education Training Program, or he has been advised and assisted by American Special Forces, he's actually more likely by like an exponential factor of either 2 or 3 to conduct a coup, right? In other words, if the United States military is, and we're talking undemocratic coups, like palace coups, sometimes they like shoot the president and old school style,
Right.
And this is really, really dangerous stuff. So like in Mali, which is kind of the centerpiece of the Sahel War, right, which is the French War. You mentioned the size of Africa, okay? France has something called Operation Barkhane going on. It's a 5-country regional, it's the largest French military operation since Algeria ended in 1962. Well, the area that it covers is 3 times the size of France. I mean, this is old school colonialism, right? The little European country just kind of goes and just takes over large swaths of the world, paints them blue, because they got to paint them blue because the British are painting stuff red in East Africa. It's old school. And the point is, so in Operation Barkhane, the centerpiece is Mali, right? That's where the whole north of the country fell to the, Tuareg rebels, and then like the Al-Qaeda types and the ISIS types, which are, it's a tenuous connection, but they use the name. Mali itself has had 2 military coups, all right? One was in 2013, 12 or 13, and one was this past August. Both of those military officers, I think they were both captains. Maybe one was a colonel, one was a captain. Well, they were both American trained. And there's been like 7 other examples of that I wrote about in a past article since I think since the founding of AFRICOM. So this idea that the problem with China and Russia, because they write this, and everyone does, okay, every serious establishment guy, they write this. They say the problem with Chinese influence, even if it's mainly economic, is that China doesn't expect any democratic sort of improvements, right? They give no strings attached aid. That's what we say. And the implication is like, we're going to make them into good democracies and Jeffersonian and all that. Right. But of course, the opposite has been true. So again, it's another like pot, kettle, meet each other situation. And so I think that's an important point you're raising.
Will, I guess we should probably move on with Mali here since we're kind of in that territory. Danny, on the last show, we talked about Mali a little bit. You had this article at the beginning of January, I think. I don't have that one loaded up. I think you had one at the beginning of January on Mali that we mentioned on the last show. So if anybody wants, I'll be sure to link that in the show notes page. I think it was Conflicts of Interest number 58. But this one that's more current, backing France's African adventures, what could go wrong, ... everything, which is a very Danny title to this article, because I mean, it really sums up what's going on, but you got a little joke in there too. I really enjoyed this one because you got into what France has been has a legacy of being up to in Mali, but what they're up to now, and how it seems like we're kind of creeping towards the direction of getting the U.S. involved. So you go ahead and pick up from there and just what's happening.
France has Francophone Africa, right? Former French Imperial Africa, which is mostly West Africa, is the most neo-imperial of all the other European countries. The French left in 1960 mostly from most of what is now the West African countries, but they never really left. I mean, none of the Europeans fully left economically and in terms of their political influence, but the French really, I mean, they wrote it into the constitutions. They helped write them of these new countries, most of which all became independent in the same year, 1960, which is instructive. And they made them write it into their constitutions that they would continue to use the CFA franc, a special African franc, which is pinned to the French franc, and they have to hold like a huge portion of their reserves in French banks, and they can't know what's happening with it. This was written into their constitutions. They also written into their constitutions, or essentially was that they had to allow French bases. They had to, basically France had to run their foreign policy almost. And so what's happening in Mali today, when it's reported on by folks like this, right, when it's reported on in most of the mainstream media, there is no context, right? And they blame that on the word count, but it's not just that. It doesn't ever mention that. It acts like history began in 2012 when the north of Mali fell to a group of Tuareg, semi-nomadic nationalists, basically, who've always had issues with the central government in Mali, which was empowered by the French, the south of Mali, where like most of the people live. There's a racial component, right? They're lighter skinned than like the darker skinned Africans. They act like that came out of nowhere. Okay, well, where it came from in the near term is that those Tuareg rebels, who fought several insurgencies against Mali before this, but this was the worst and the most successful for them. They came out of Libya because they had gone to work for, excuse me, they'd gone to support Gaddafi, who supported Tuareg nationalism to some extent, somewhat self-serving. When we destroy Libya, in 2011, French were big on that, by the way, even though we had to resupply their planes, right, because they ran out of ammunition in like the first 48 hours. Those rebels came with all Gaddafi's arsenal. And they were like, well, guess we'll go home and take over the north of our country and recreate our dreams since we lost this war in Libya. But actually, the story goes further back, which is to this 1960 independence. The French never gave up control of Africa. In fact, a number of French previous presidents, and we're even talking guys like Mitterrand and Francois Hollande, so even the socialists, they'll say stuff like, listen, without Africa, France is a bit player. It's a third-rate, actor. The two things that keep France a major player in their minds, a pretended world power, there's only two things. Three, actually, I'm sorry. The first is their veto at the UN. But along with that veto at the UN is that they've got about 20 countries they used to own in Africa who vote their way. They control them, right? So they got General Assembly votes, they got a big, powerful bloc, and they got their veto. The second thing is just their influence in Africa, the idea that they still have this economic power and profits from it, this military basing, this overseas expeditionary nature. So we're not just another EU country. And the third thing, and it's related to Africa, is that we have an independent nuclear program. And this was really important to the French and de Gaulle and stuff. We can even go kind of our own way, right? Third way during the Cold War. France is still France. We're not just going to follow the Americans like F Disney World, that whole French thing. But a big part of it was we're an independent nuclear power with our own deterrent. Now, in order to be an independent nuclear power, they need one thing, and that's uranium. And all the uranium is in Niger. So is it an accident, right, that France has maintained that basing and is so interested in what happens there and is so interested that the Tuaregs, who don't really like French colonialism or neo-imperialism, aren't in control in those places. So that's the backstory to all of this. But what I've been writing about recently is it's falling apart. It was never going particularly well, but there was even an article in the New York Times that referred to it as France's forever war in the Sahel, and that's what it is. And it's called a forever war, and France's Afghanistan. You'll see that phrase a lot, even in French papers. And they say, oh, it's an 8-year war and there's no end in sight. Well, I would argue it's actually a much longer war than that because France has intervened in its African colonies around 50 times since 1960. So, look, the reason the French and the Americans butt heads sometimes is they are so similar. They're the two most universalist, exceptionalist countries on the planet, and they're also the two most expeditionary military countries on the planet. And I think that's sort of the story in Mali. And the real recent story is that, like, the French are losing soldiers. Mali's falling apart. Violence is worse than ever. And Macron sees in Biden a bailout that the Americans might pick up more of the slack for the French, just like when we had to resupply their planes in Libya. Now, we already finance, fuel, provide logistics, and provide almost all of the targeting intelligence to Operation Barkhane, which is the French op in those 5 countries in the Sahel. All of that happens under the radar. No one realizes that France only fights its neo-imperial war in West Africa because we support it. It can't do it without us. They can't. They can't assassinate people from the sky without us. They only just started using their own drones in West Africa. So this is all happening in secret. The American people were never consulted on any of this. And now I really believe that Macron sees in this like internationalist, liberal interventionist new administration, unlike Trump, who was like kind of not so sure how he felt about Africa, maybe I'll pull out a little bit. They see a bailout coming. And the question is whether Biden is going to have the capacity, courage, and even information presented to him to just say, wait, this is a mistake because France is losing. And isn't it time after 9/11 we stop backing losing ventures? Because wouldn't that be nice for once?
Now, do you get the idea that the Biden administration is going to oblige that, is going to start picking up the slack more for the French?
I think if the Biden administration believes that it can do it without losing very many American soldiers and without any terrible stories or scandals breaking into the news, then I think they probably will marginally but significantly, like real, small increases in help for the French. I think that the think tank industrial complex funded by the war industry has been spewing so much alarmism about especially ISIS in West Africa and all over Africa, because that's why we've got those Green Berets in Mozambique, which I can talk about in a second. But there's a lot of alarmism coming about ISIS. It's interesting that they use ISIS. I think it's because ISIS, conjures in the American people's mind, like the orange jumpsuits and all that, and like the beheadings and stuff. But actually, ISIS is the weaker player than the Al-Qaeda linked groups in West Africa by far, by far. In fact, they fight each other. No one ever mentions that. But I think that alarmism and the fact that, like Obama, I fear that the Biden administration will see Africa as like a proving and a testing ground for this notion of like an abstract, invisible, tech savvy proxy, low casualty, low cost for Americans form of warfare. And so we can stay at war forever, but we can say, look, we're not like those Bushies who invade countries and get us locked down in quagmires. But the problem with all that is the outcomes for Africans are terrible, usually. Counterproductive. We ultimately don't solve any of the root problems. But that makes sense because here's the thing that no one ever talks about. AFRICOM is a lot of things, but it ain't about Africans, and it never was.
Right. Is AFRICOM even based in Africa yet, or is it still based in Germany?
It's still based in Germany, and that's a fun backstory no one ever talks about. None of the countries in Africa would agree to host AFRICOM. They were all like, we don't want an American. Like the Africans, wouldn't you know? So strange, right? African people, they're like really scared of like European and Western imperialism. They're really sensitive about it. I can't imagine why. Maybe it's because they got entirely gobbled up as a continent over the course of 40 years, not even, right? The imperialism in Africa was the fastest in like history. I mean, they just gobbled it up, scramble for Africa. And then these guys offhandedly use that phrase. And I'm like, what did Africans say if they read this article? But they don't care. They're not about that, right? They're about American, like coloring the map, like pink and blue, like the British school children in London, right? Singing in Cockney as they like, color it in. No, I think this is important though. No one would host it. In fact, there was a lot of pressure on the one or two countries that thought about hosting it, like Liberia, because they've always kind of been an American protectorate for a lot of reasons. There were the African parliament, like the parliament that's part of the AU, whatever the representative function there is. They even like voted to say, no one shall. And I think it was a unanimous vote. Like no one will host AFRICOM. That is so awkward. I mean, it's so awkward that I enjoy it. Like it's so indecent and absurd, but it's never reported on. Also, didn't get mentioned in this article. So from now on, like anytime we talk about Africa and like I make a point, it's gonna be like also not mentioned in the article because I think it's important. So yeah, this guy ran special forces in Africa, this co-author, and he did so from Germany. And we're not supposed to laugh at how absurdly, accurately neo-imperialist that sounds.
Right. Will, anything else on Mali?
No, I did not have any.
All right, Dan, you have another article on Chad here. We need to talk about Chad Franco, America's favorite hired gun. And, you talk about how Chad is deploying forces as a part of this French endeavor. But I seem to remember from not many years ago that there was an attempted coup in Chad where there was only a convoy, like 250 militants coming from Libya that were trying to, I guess, overthrow the government. And France ended up carrying out airstrikes to prevent that from happening. So
Yeah.
I was shocked when I read this article just because it seems to me that if I were a dictatorial leader, I would want to keep all my troops at home, especially if I had a reminder in the past couple of years of why you might not want, your troops to be out and about in different countries running around when you might need protection. So this seems like a recipe for instability. I guess let's talk about the country on the other side of the Sahel now.
Yeah, I apologize to all the people with this name, but like, has anyone ever like met a Chad that they like in real life? Like, let alone, I mean, I don't even like the name. I mean, Chad is interesting. I'm kidding mostly, but I mean, it's like if a frat boy became a country. The thing about Chad is, first of all, it's the archetypal synthetic neo-imperial creation, colonial creation. I mean, it's the archetypal like African basket case. I mean, it's had like more coup attempts and coups than any other country. It's had more dictators backed by the West. It's got more synthetic lines and sort of ethnic groups that can't even speak each other's language living in these same borders. I mean, and sometimes I think history can also be instructive. I mean, it's accidentally named after the lake in its southwest, Lake Chad. I mean, the locals, they said, what is this? Like, the French guys were like, hey, what's this place called? And what is this? And they were like, they pointed like basically to the lake, and they were like, Chad, and that means lake, right? Of course, that's funny to me because Chad is a desert largely, so it's named lake accidentally and by mistake. So the deal that Deby, right, the dictator, since 1990. I think he's the second longest serving leader in the world. Keeps changing the constitution, keeps moving the goalposts so he can stay president indefinitely. The reason he's in power largely is because of the French. And the French backed the guy before him, who was like even worse, if that's possible. I mean, he massacred them, and America backed him too, because he didn't like Libya, and so when Libya got involved and even tried to invade northern Chad, he was with us. So he was like, okay, if he wants to murder children, then I guess we have to allow that because Gaddafi's bad, right? So this is how this indecency happens. But the devil's bargain that maintains the instability, not only in Chad but regionally, is that these guys like Deby, this dictator, they agree that they will serve as the mercenary hired guns for France and now for AFRICOM, because Chad sends more soldiers, more places to do our bidding than any other country in the region. I mean, I think they just agreed to send more at the G5 Sahel conference that Macron, the French president, just chaired by Zoom. And of course, France's campaign headquarters for Operation Barkhane is headquartered in Chad, and so is the regional intervention in the Lake Chad region, which is like Cameroon, Nigeria, is fighting Boko Haram. That's also headquartered in Chad. So Chad rents its space out to these like European and Western American dominated, regional interventions, and then it gives its hired guns away. Of course, there's two ways of looking at that. They agree to do that because if there's ever a rebellion or a coup attempt, this was recent. It was like 2018 or something. France will literally bomb rebels on behalf of a dictator, because he plays by their rules. Some might say, as I think you're pointing out, well, why would you want to send your soldiers away if, you got so much instability at home? Wouldn't you want to keep them close? Yes, in some ways. So by doing this intervention thing, they do weaken themselves at home, and they maintain these like constant, flow of coups, and then the French have to get involved and bomb, people that the French people have never met, never heard of, never had a problem with, but whatever, they bomb them, without a vote in the French parliament. But the other thing is the army itself is a threat to the dictator. Some units can't speak to each other. There are like different ethnic groups, different tribal groups and sects within the military. And so sometimes what Deby does is he sends units that he thinks might be a problem. He'll be like, these guys might overthrow me, so we'll send them to Mali to get waxed and stuck in a quagmire out there. It really is the archetypal basket case of Africa. And that's not an insult to the Chadian people, who have been ignored and devastated and starved, with Western complicity since forever. I mean, France is giving like these old armored vehicles to this horrific regime, and I wonder how much bread, grain, and vaccines, that could have paid for in a country where life expectancy only recently got into the 40s, right? Into like that many years. I mean, so this is gross. And the American people and the Western people, they don't know about it. If they knew about it, would they care about it? I don't know. It seems pretty far away, except we are enabling this. How many times have you had someone in your life be like, hey, you really should enable that friend of yours who's an alcoholic or something? Like, people will get really sensitive about that, but like, we enable the murder of children. Here's my favorite anecdote about Chad. I promise I'm done with this. Deby he was involved in like a war with South Sudan and also fighting against rebel groups in the north. And Deby, the dictator of Chad, was using child soldiers. Everyone knew it. I mean, it was really obvious. And there's like a law in the books, crazy, right, that says the United States military can't like give aid to countries that are using child soldiers. Wouldn't you know that the first African president, right, the first African-American president with an African father, Democrat, liberal, Nobel Peace Laureate, quietly pushed through a waiver to that law so Chad could continue to receive military aid? I'm telling you right now, that piece of information alone should have shut AFRICOM down, should have taken Barack Obama to like a show trial, Moscow style, where they stripped his Nobel Prize away from him like it was in the army, and they like ripped the patch off when they kick you out of military school. That fact alone should change American policy, and it didn't even cause like a whisper of public debate. And that's the story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, the people who defend this stuff, the people who, try to, like those three military officers we were just talking about, they talk all about this good governance and stuff. But it does seem like this is sort of part and parcel of getting more and more involved in this region, is backing these governments and these regimes that have, terrible human rights records, they're election tamperers, and, their power is completely illegitimate, and we go and bolster that. And again, like, we sort of already hit on this, but it only drives the conflict and extremism, and it becomes this sort of self-licking ice cream cone where the more we get involved, the more the metrics go down, the internal displacement, the civilian casualties, and that just justifies further involvement for not only us but for the French too.
Like I said, I almost forgot the child soldier bit, and anything about Chad also not mentioned by these three polite imperialists, right? So not mentioned, but this is important. Okay, scholars always know the answer usually. I mean, the serious scholars know how silly this all is, but they just, instead of like marching in the streets because that like hurts your feet and stuff, or actually getting active or speaking or writing in a public way instead of like an academic jargon way, they're not into that so much, most of them. But they know the deal. It's because study after study has shown that why do Al-Qaeda, vaguely Islamist groups form in Africa? There's dozens of studies. I read them all. And what they say is that there are two main drivers, right? So one driver is that they play on the existing sort of ethnic and regional tensions, and it's usually north-south. So usually it's, look, the more nomadic desert areas where like the Tuaregs live and some of the other tribes, wherever the pastoralists live, right, the semi-nomadic folks, they always have been ignored and not received their fair share from the south, right, from the farmers, from the settled urban people. So they play on that. They say, look, like, we'll help you, like, we've got guns, and they'll speak that language rather than like the global Islamism stuff as much. And the second way they do it is they say, look, the government that is ignoring you about your own economic and farming concerns and stuff, or economic concerns, they're also actually tools of the Western imperialists, and look how brutal they are, look how corrupt they are, and look how the Westerners are like, this is really about America spreading its empire, and they play on that. And so those two things fit perfectly with the American model of counterproductivity. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when someone writes the seminal history of the American empire, it really should be called the United States of counterproductivity, because everything that we do usually fuels the enemy we fight, which is why you get conspiracy theorists saying, look, it's all an inside job, whether it's 9/11 or anything else. Like, the deep state wants, they go too far with some of these conspiracy theories, but the general sense, you see why it forms. It forms because the truth is we do create the wars that we then use to justify the military spending. And Africa is really a classic example, as it often is, actually, because it's very extreme in Africa. So it's very overt, if you're paying attention, and no one is, of course.
I mean, that's such an important point, Danny, because especially when I read a lot of news about Africa, and I try to keep up with at least what's going on in the countries that the U.S. and France seem to be very active in. And boy, if you read like Reuters or something, every day or every other day, there's a story from Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, one of these countries in this region where 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 75, 100 sometimes civilians were killed by men on motorbikes show up, and they always phrase it as Islamic militants. That's who usually gets the blame for it. And what you're saying is they don't show up, the jihadists don't show up, give these guys a Quran and say, read it this way, and then they're willing to go and kill a village full of civilians. They play on the ethnic tensions, they play on the colonial legacy and all the problems that are kind of created by U.S. foreign policy. And that's what the U.S. because I'm sure, Danny, if you push back, they would probably read off. They could go and read down a list and be like, so do these 400 lives not matter? All these people who have died in the last month in this region, you don't want to save them. You just want to let them be slaughtered to death by jihadists.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, because if they act like history started yesterday, and if history started when that Reuters report came out, then, and since it has no context, you would say, look, don't you want to stop this killing? Of course, it ignores the fact that, for example, the security forces in the Sahel in this past year were responsible for as many deaths or more, depending on the study you read, as the Islamists. So that's ignored. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, well, what's the backstory? I mean, you tell me any story, and my immediate reflex is, hold on, stop. What's the backstory? Like literally, that's what I say always. Tell me the backstory, because there's something to this, right? Very rarely is it just evil that causes something. And so the question becomes, does U.S. military intervention save lives? And what I'm saying, based on not just that I want to hate America, but because I read things like credentialed, peer-reviewed stuff, right? What we know, it's not a question. What we know is American military intervention doesn't help and makes everything worse. And so it fuels these conflicts. It creates a situation where most of these folks don't want to live in a caliphate. That's true everywhere. I mean, that's very rare that like the majority of any population wants to live in a caliphate. Okay, so let's turn the clock further back on the backstory. The Sahel and West Africa has largely been one of the more like syncretic and less doctrinaire areas when it comes to Islam. Traditionally, I mean, well up until the 1970s, it's basically unheard of. Like Islamism, right? This sort of like Wahhabi version is unheard of. It doesn't exist. So what? Overnight, they just all got evil and decided that they were, jihadis? No, something happened. And part of what happened is that the U.S. and the Western countries started kind of fueling these conflicts and giving justification and legitimacy. That's the key word. The key word is this. These corrupt military coup-driven governments that we back lack legitimacy in the eyes of a significant portion of their population. That lack of legitimacy means that there is a legitimacy vacuum, and vacuums don't like to exist. And so someone is going to, for self-serving reasons, going to try to fill that vacuum of legitimacy. They're going to create courts. They're going to give like some version of social services that the government's not giving them. And who's been doing it from Morocco to Central Asia, right? From Morocco to Pakistan. Well, it's tended since the 1970s, late 1970s, for a lot of reasons, to be the Islamist groups. And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's what they would fire back with. These authors would fire back with those stats. Look how many people the Islamists are killing. But they either don't know, or worse still, they do know, but opportunistically will, in order to fuel our militarism, will ignore that. We'll leave that out purposely. And that omission is a lie of omission, and then it becomes a crime of omission.
Yeah. There's Skyhorn has good explanations for that, like with the Taliban and how they establish systems of justice. Skyray of like some of the child rape stuff, or in Somalia with the Islamic Courts Union. They just somebody established justice. But I'll let you jump in.
No, that's basically all I had on the on this section here.
All right, Danny, I want to definitely, before we wrap, get back to Ethiopia, because that's what we spent most of the last time I had you on the show about. And, so this is moving across Africa to the east. Now we're almost at the Red Sea, although Ethiopia, as we talked about, doesn't actually have a border with the Red Sea, but does have share a lot of borders with a lot of different countries. Since Biden has taken over, I haven't heard Biden mention Ethiopia, but I have heard his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, regularly making condemnations of Ethiopia and calling for different UN measures. I believe he spoke with the head of the UN very recently about this, saying that we need international investigations into Ethiopia. And as we talked about, Danny, some pretty ugly stuff probably happened there in the recent months. But what do you think are the prospects now that we're a couple months into the Biden administration of being able to stay out of Ethiopia specifically, but Africa overall, in these ideas of humanitarian intervention?
Yeah, I mean, again, we go back to the idea that American military intervention and American support for corrupt and illegitimate proxies is counterproductive. But we do tend to have our favorite hired gun, like our favorite hired gun on the continent. So there, anyone who's driven through Colorado has passed the Continental Divide, and it's very exciting. Ooh, we just passed the Continental Divide. Well, in Africa, the Continental Divide is in Chad. So Chad is the go-to hired gun to send its troops to do our bidding of choice in West Africa. So it's kind of in the center, but Chad tends to send its troops west, into the Sahel, into West Africa. In the Horn of Africa, in Northeast Africa, Ethiopia is our hired gun of choice, right? They invaded Somalia largely for us and with our backing. They make up a big part of a lot of African Union missions throughout the continent. And the dirty little secret is that Ethiopia's government lacks a lot of legitimacy too. And so now what's interesting about the Biden administration is like Trump's people they usually would stay silent on a lot of stuff. They weren't interested most of the time in Africa. And sometimes that was good because they'd be like, hey, let's go out of Somalia. What are we doing? And that like resonated in the heartland of America because everyone was like, what are we doing in Africa? But it was also bad sometimes because we would like overlook certain human rights abuses. But, Secretary of State Blinken referred to what's happening right now in Ethiopia in the aftermath of this Tigray war, where we talked about in the last show, where another peace laureate waged war on his own people brutally. But, Blinken just said that what's happening in Ethiopia right now is ethnic cleansing. And that's interesting because, again, I'm looking at a Bloomberg article right now, where he talks about that. And what he's referring to is that not only did, Ethiopia's central government basically attack and occupy one of its regional federal districts. There's 10 of them. It's a very federal system under its constitution. And a lot of people think there that he's like the new emperor, right? He wants to be like the new emperor Haile Selassie. He wants to centralize power. He wants to dominate the country through the two main ethnic groups, which his mother and father are from, which is the Oromo and the Amhara. The Amhara have generally dominated. They're kind of like the royal ruling class in Ethiopia. When Ethiopia was an African empire, it was the Amhara who conquered all the other 100 groups, ethnic groups that are within the borders of Ethiopia. It's kind of like an African version of European imperialism. Well, in the aftermath of the war, wouldn't you know recently that the Amhara district, right, the Amhara federal region, has seized some disputed territories from Tigray and other bordering areas. And then immediately, Abe, the prime minister, who the West loves, because he's like, he does like neoliberalism for us. He gets his troops involved in all this stuff in East Africa. He's our hired gun on that side of the continental divide. He immediately rubber stamped it and said, yep. And he even used Amhara ethnic militias, including youth militias, death squads. He used them officially as part of his invasion. So it wasn't just, I talked about this last time, that's the poisoning of the well. That's how you know he's wrong. Like sometimes people will do one thing and then that shows their true color. So Abiy used regional military forces because each of the regions has their own security forces. He used the federal army, but he also used and allowed and enabled these Amhara militias, some of which were death squads and massacred villagers. And so, okay, so Blinken says it's ethnic cleansing. Now the question is, will that be an announcement? Will that be like a quick poke in the eye that passes through the UN and then no one talks about it again? Or will we address the root problem, which is that we are backing a lot of these people? Will we pull our support away from these corrupt tin pot dictators? Of course, in Ethiopia, it's more than that because that's the second most populous country on the continent. It's got about 110 million people. Nigeria is the only one that's got a larger population. But are we going to pull support from these people and help eliminate the root causes, one of which, not the only of which, because it's not all about us, even though we think it is, because we're the exceptional, indispensable nation, right? We have like a mental disorder. Like it would be clinical. Exceptionalism is a clinical, disease, right, in mental health. But when countries do it, it's just patriotism. But the bottom line, though, is are we going to address the root problem, or is this going to be Blinken speaking like the Democrat, polite, urbane human rights language and then doing business as usual? My bet as a cynic is on the latter, and that's what keeps me up at night and why I'm a weirdo and an insufferable, exasperating voice. But one would hope that we would actually address some of this, because I do think there are people in the administration who probably know better at the mid-range, but they get relegated to the basement like Milton from Office Space looking for a stapler. No one listens to the people who really know, the regional experts in the State Department, because the powerful people, the political appointees, they either know better and don't care because they're neo-imperialist militarists, or they don't know. And so my vote is that we'll see a lot more of the same from the Biden administration.
Right. Yeah, I'm just curious, Danny, what's your read on sort of the situation on the ground right now in Tigray? Like, are you aware if there's still fighting going on? Like, I know the Abiy Ahmed government had said something about, they won the war, it's all over. But I'd recently seen Doctors Without Borders like condemning, these ethnic militias going around and like, attacking clinics and hospitals and stuff. And I got the feeling that they were, talking about some stuff that was happening recently. So are you aware of like what level of fighting is still continuing there?
I'm aware that there is a level of fighting continuing. So part of this, there's a two-part answer to that I think is the story. So the first is that the fighting has continued. The Tigray Liberation Front has not surrendered. They said they're going to fight on, and they're in the hills and the caves and stuff, the mountainous region. They're not super effective yet, but they are maintaining a low-level insurgency. I think you may see that continue. And then the second one is the reason I don't know the level of it is because the amount of reporting that's getting out is minimal. For the first part of the war, there was a complete media blackout. They shut the phones down. They shut the internet down. They wouldn't let journalists in. Now they've lifted some of that, but it's very hard to get credible information out of Tigray. I mean, it's a closed system by design. Abiy doesn't want you to see his indecency. He doesn't want you to see the skeletons in his closet. He wants you to see what's happening in Addis Ababa, right? He wants you to see the new buildings that they have. He wants you to see where the African Union headquarters is. He wants to show you the pretty parts of Ethiopia, the western parts, right? The western-backed parts. So it's very difficult to know, but whether this explodes into a long-term guerrilla war or whether they're able to keep it tamped down to this low-level insurgency is an open question. But I do think that the seeds for future war and rebellion are not being addressed, or in other words, they exist by not being addressed, and it's a legitimacy problem again. The West backs Abiy, even though we're saying some bad things about him publicly. But does anyone really think that the Biden administration is going to pull support from this guy when he's such a useful hired gun in Somalia? I don't see it happening, especially now that they want to sort of reverse evil Trump pulling those troops out of Somalia, right? If that's bad because Trump did it, then we have to pivot back in the old direction, which is reinfusion of either our troops or our proxies into Ethiopia. Well, it looks bad to send 600 American soldiers right back into Somalia. That's not going to play very well politically or with the American public. So wouldn't it be easier if you could send just 600 more or 1,200 more Ethiopians in? How many Ethiopians does it take to be as effective as a Green Beret? Well, that's how many we'll send in. And they'll do it for us because they're on the east side of the Continental Divide, and they're our favorite proxy in East Africa. So this is why I'm cynical about it, not just because I want to be, because the evidence and the track record bears it out.
Yeah, it's a great point of the limited access to some of these regions of the world, because I feel like there's a sense from the general population, Danny, that if that was actually happening, like there would be CNN reporters like flying to Ethiopia being like, are you really going to like stop like a white female reporter from going in and showing like these images? Are you going to arrest like Don Lemon or someone like that? Like that they would do these kind of things. But then you see like in Kashmir, they didn't have internet for like a year and a half, and there was like no reporting coming out of there. Nobody knows how many people are dying from U.S. drone strikes, which drastically increased under the Trump administration in Somalia, because there's no reporters there. There's no reporting to do it. You could go on Air Wars and read the claims, and they do a really thorough job making sure they're not, reporting every last claim as a for sure airstrike. But in so many of the cases, you could just see that like the U.S. dropped a bomb somewhere, and they say that 7 ISIS or 8 Al-Shabaab were killed, and that's what gets reported, and nothing else gets touched on any of these subjects. So that's why the work you do writing about Africa is so important. Before we wrap, Danny, do you have anything on Mozambique? Just because last time on the show I said you got anything else and you mentioned it, and just before recording this, I think yesterday I read that we're deploying 12 Green Berets there to aid the Marines in that country. And so boy, I was, worried about, Northern Africa, West Africa, East Africa. But here, we got to go way down and kind of on the African continent across from Madagascar, in between Tanzania and South Africa, you have Mozambique. And they say ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. And you say that enough times and apparently U.S. Green Berets appear.
Traditionally, the one area where like direct U.S. military involvement in Africa never really happened was Southern Africa. I mean, traditionally, that's been the case. We used apartheid South Africa, and to some extent, they're like petite apartheid Rhodesia as our proxies. Like we backed them until the mid '80s when we finally abandoned them in the face of their racial indecency. But we very rarely like sent advisors down there. If you look at the maps that like The Intercept and Nick Turse have put out of like where the U.S. military bases are in Africa since AFRICOM, they're very rarely south of the Congo. But hey, markets need to expand, and the market for militarism needs to expand. And an ISIS affiliate has cropped up in northeastern Mozambique for all local reasons, mainly. Okay, it's the same story where it's like they feel like they're not getting the resources and social services from the government. They're being ignored. The fact that they're Muslim and the rest of Mozambique isn't is like they're being demonized. It's all the same local stuff that goes on in almost every African country. It's usually a north-south divide that breaks down on both religion and form of income, right? Pastoralist versus farming and stuff. Not exactly the case in Mozambique. This is an important story because 12 Green Berets doesn't sound like a lot. But when a Green Beret team comes in, they bring a lot with them. They got a lot of tech equipment. They got a lot of air cover dedicated to them. I had a team attached to me in Afghanistan. I couldn't believe the amount of equipment, support, and resources and logistics that they could call on. More than my troop of 120, right? So it is a big story. But what's really a big story about it is the fact that we're there at all, because we usually don't go into Southern Africa. So, neo-imperialism is going, we've done the French variety. That's fun, right? In West Africa, we dabble with the British variety in East Africa. And now we're going obscure, which is what I like. I love obscure conflicts. We're going Portugal, right? Mozambique, which is one of the last African countries to get its independence from Portugal in 1975, along with Angola. And now we're going down there. And it doesn't surprise me because wouldn't you know, and I wrote an article about this at anywhere.com, wouldn't you know that last year, mid-year, the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, as well as some other think tanks which picked up the report or wrote their own, did all these alarmist reports on how ISIS is expanding in Africa. And one of the areas they really highlighted was this insurgency in northern Mozambique, because it's a new market. It's like, look, it's expanding so much that it's even in the places it usually isn't, because, usually it's in like Muslim Africa, like northern Africa.
Right.
But the thing is, the Mozambique, like all the other issues, is a local concern that's driving a lot of it. These Green Berets are not going to, insist or help the government to fix its like root economic problems and its root corruption problems. That's not what they're there to do. They're just going to help the security forces to fight. And so they're going to end up fueling it. And then the other thing to keep in mind about this is that just because you have the ISIS name doesn't mean you're run from the Caliphate in Raqqa, which, by the way, there isn't one any longer, right? So these franchises, how much in common does the McDonald's here in Kansas have to do with the McDonald's near you? The owners don't even know each other, right? It's just a name. It's a name. But it's even less so because they don't even serve the same food or speak the same language in these ISIS affiliates. And so I'm just saying the fact that they're called ISIS is what justifies us sending these Green Berets there. And I saw this coming, frankly, and I said something similar when I read the report out of the West Point Counterterrorism Center, which is written by the same type of guys, by the way, who wrote this report, all right? The same kind of like faux intellectuals. And, when they raise the alarm, wait for it. Give it 6 months, give it a year. The Pentagon and then the U.S. government, which vaguely controls it, will respond. They will respond, and so this is the start. Is it going to stop with 12 Green Berets? History tells me it may not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I always consider too is that I'm a lot of times I think the special forces come with money, and there's this 127 Echo program, I think is what it's called, where they're allowed to give. I know at least in North Africa, in the Middle East, they do it like forces that they ally with. They're able to give quite a good amount of money to. So maybe financial help to the Mozambique Marines there. Well,
and by the way,
go ahead.
A lot of those units are human rights abusers, and so by giving that money, they are violating the Leahy laws of 1997, which say that we're not allowed to give military aid to individual units within a country's military if there are credible allegations of human rights abuses. But that's like one of those. That's one of those laws that's like in name only and is never actually enforced. But yeah, so if the root cause of Mozambique's problem, like all the others, is corruption at home and economic just like mismanagement and not giving evenly the social services to all the countries, then one would think that these really forward-thinking special forces that are so much better than conventional forces, that they would give that money, to those places, right? They would fight the root problem. No, they just give new body armor, right? They just give new body armor and new weapons to security forces who then massacre villagers. I mean, that it sounds hyperbolic, but it happens enough, and it's accurate enough of the time that it is worth stating it that way. Mm-hmm. So we don't fight the root problem. We pour fuel on the fire that's causing it, and then we say, look at our great Green Berets, just forward-thinking, savvy folks. And it's all a lie. It's all a lie. It's a big lie, and it's a long con. That's what I'm going to title my book on U.S. policy in Africa: The Big Lie and the Long Con.
Yeah, I mean, I hope me and Will are like 85 episodes in now, so regular listeners of the show shouldn't have too much trouble, believing that the groups that we arm often commit worse massacres than the people that we're allegedly arming them against. Will, anything before we wrap?
No, that's all I had. Danny, it's great picking your brain. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm just glad that you guys care about this, and I'm happy to do it anytime. I have a feeling more things are going to happen to talk about in Africa as well as anywhere else.
Right. Definitely. I mean, with everything going on, like Afghanistan, Iraq, and you having personal experience there, but you're such a unique voice on Africa. There's so few people that write on it where that seeps anywhere into like antiwar.com isn't like the mainstream or anything, but they are a website with some recognition. But most of the time, if you want like English reporting commentary at all on Africa, like Twitter is the best place to like go and follow the right accounts. So thank you so much for what you do, Danny. People follow him. You're at Skeptical Vet on Twitter. You're a contributor at antiwar.com. You're right there every week. It's always fantastic. Sometimes we run more than one of your articles every week. What else? Where else can people? Fortress on the Hill is your podcast.
I was gonna say,
check out Fortress on the Hill podcast. We have an episode dropping. Hedrick Smith, who was part of the Pentagon Papers release team at the New York Times. And then, if you want to keep up with my writing, I mean, my name's pretty unique. You could Google it, but skepticalvet.com. So Twitter is Skeptical Vet, website Skeptical Vet. And I just appreciate you having me on here. And I'm going to be doing a lot of this. I'm going to be screaming into the high heavens with my ever-indulgent work.
All right. Thank you so much, Danny.
Thank you, Danny.
Thanks for having me.